This is Station 3. I'm Atlas, your voice cutting through the cracks and shadows of a fractured world. It's 2,300 hours, and here I am again, sifting through the ashes of the life we once knew, speaking into the void. 11 days. That's how long it's been since I last broadcasted. Feels longer, doesn't it? Every hour stretches. Every moment feels like it's teetering on the edge of something unknown. Time's funny like that now, weighty, uneven, no longer the straight line we once trusted. But let's not linger on the ticking of the clock. Time is a luxury we can't afford to waste. Not when the world's twisting and turning faster than we can map it. I've seen things these past days that make me question the very ground I walk on, the skies I look up to, and the air I breathe. If you're still out there, still listening, you've likely noticed it too. Things aren't just dangerous anymore, they're deliberate, intentional, and we're caught in the middle of it. The rules we used to rely on, the simple ones like day follows night or water flows downhill, are starting to crumble. 11 days ago, I told you about shadows that didn't behave, lights that didn't belong, and ground that seemed to come alive beneath your feet. Now I've seen even more. I've walked through places where the air whispers your name, where echoes don't just repeat, they respond. The world is talking back, survivors, and I'm not sure we're ready to hear what it has to say. These past few days, I've crossed paths with places that defy description. There was a canyon I didn't recognize, carved into a landscape I thought I knew. Its walls shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and when I called out to test the depth, the echoes didn't come back the way they should have. They weren't just distorted, they were wrong. Words I hadn't spoken came out of the void. Fragments of broadcasts I'd sent before, mixed with sentences I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. Whatever's down there, it's not just rock and emptiness. Then there are the skies. Survivors have reported fractures, rippling seams of light cutting across the heavens like scars. I saw it myself 2 nights ago. Brief flashes that outlined symbols in the clouds, shapes that pulsed and disappeared before you could make sense of them. Some say it's the weapons we unleashed in the war, tearing holes in the fabric of the sky. Others whisper about something else, something older, waking up in the aftermath. Whatever it is, the sky isn't ours anymore. Look up, but don't stare too long. You might see something staring back. Drones are still patrolling, their movements sharper, their intent more focused. They don't just scan anymore, they wait. They linger over areas like they're deciding what to do, like they're thinking. I saw a formation yesterday, 3 drones hovering in perfect silence over a patch of forest. They stayed there for hours before one broke off, its spotlight scanning the treetops. Survivors in the area reported burns on the ground where the light touched. If you're seeing drones, don't assume you can outlast their patience. They've got time on their side, and we don't. And yet, for all the chaos, there are pockets of quiet that feel just as unnatural. I stumbled upon an open market recently, untouched and pristine. The stalls were still stocked, produce sitting in neat piles as though the world hadn't ended. But the silence was overwhelming. No birds, no wind, no sound of any kind. Just the faint hum of something beneath the cobblestones. A vibration you could feel if you stood still long enough. On the side of one stall, scrawled in jagged letters, was a single word. Wait. I didn't. If you come across a place like that, I suggest you don't either. It's not just the places we find. It's the things we leave behind. I discovered a cache left by survivors, marked with a white X and a blinking beacon. Inside was a black box, about the size of a brick, pulsing faintly when I touched it. It felt cold, even through gloves. There were journals too, full of notes about safe zones and something called threshold experiments. The words were scattered, fragmented, like the writer didn't have time to finish. The more I read, the more it felt like the cache wasn't just meant to help, it was meant to bait. Be careful where curiosity leads you, survivors. Not every open door is worth walking through. So here we are, 11 days since the last time I sat in this chair, staring at a map that doesn't make sense anymore. Roads that led somewhere yesterday loop back on themselves today. Landmarks vanish overnight, replaced by stretches of nothingness that feel wrong in ways you can't put into words. It's like the world is unbuilding itself, piece by piece, or maybe rebuilding itself into something we don't recognize. Either way, standing still isn't an option. We have to move, even when the ground beneath us threatens to pull us under. Survivors, I know this isn't the reassurance you're looking for. I can't tell you it's going to get better. I can't tell you it'll make sense. All I can do is share what I've seen, what I've heard, and hope it helps you make it through another day. The world is changing faster than we can understand, and we're running to catch up. But you're still here. You're still listening, and that counts for something. The sky used to be something we could trust, didn't it? A constant above us, an anchor to remind us where we stood. Now it feels like another enemy, unpredictable, fractured, and alive in ways we never imagined. Survivors, if you've been looking up recently, you've probably noticed it too. The skies aren't just watching us. They're unraveling, splitting apart like fabric stretched too thin. I've been hearing reports from across the regions. Survivors have described glowing seams in the night sky, ribbons of light that don't belong. 2 nights ago, I saw it myself while sheltering in an abandoned hangar near what used to be an airfield. The clouds split open without warning, and the light wasn't like lightning. It didn't flash and fade. It shimmered, rippling like water disturbed by a pebble. For a moment, shapes formed in the gaps, symbols etched in brief brilliance before disappearing as if they'd never existed. They didn't match anything I've seen before, and I don't think they were meant for us to understand. There's a pattern to these fractures. They don't show up randomly. Survivors have noted that the lights tend to align with certain landmarks, places where the ground already feels off, where symbols are carved into trees or scorched into stone. It's almost as if the sky and the earth are communicating, leaving trails we're not meant to follow. And yet, some do. One group I heard from followed the light to a clearing deep in the forest, where the air buzzed with static and the temperature dropped like a stone. They didn't stay long, but the way they described the place, it sounded less like a destination and more like a warning. Then there's the silence that comes with these events. It's a hollow, suffocating stillness, the kind that makes you realize how loud the world normally is, even when you think it's quiet. No birds, no wind, just an unnatural hush that presses against your ears like water. I felt it during that storm, and I've heard it in other places since. It's not just the absence of sound, it's the presence of something else, something that doesn't want to be heard but wants to be felt. The fractures don't just affect the sky. Survivors have noticed changes in the air around them during these events. There's a charge to it, a static that prickles your skin and makes the hair on your arms stand up. Some have reported faint whispers carried on the wind, voices just at the edge of perception. A few have even claimed to hear their own names spoken softly, almost reverently, as if the sky itself is calling out to them. I don't know what's worse, the thought that it's all in their heads, or the possibility that it isn't. It's not just the glowing seams either. Survivors in coastal areas have reported strange movements in the clouds, spirals that seem to form and dissolve without any natural explanation. A fisherman, one of the few still venturing out onto the water, described seeing a vortex above the sea, a perfect spiral of clouds that rotated silently for minutes before collapsing in on itself. He said the water beneath it churned violently, as if something massive was rising from below. He didn't wait to see what it was. The drones seemed to be drawn to these events too. Multiple reports have come in about drones hovering near sky fractures, their red lights scanning the ground as if searching for something specific. One survivor said they watched a drone circle a glowing seam for hours, its movements almost hesitant, like it was unsure of what to do next. The idea of drones hesitating, of these machines adapting to something we don't understand, is a chilling thought. If they're reacting to the same forces we are, then maybe we're not the only ones trying to make sense of all this. And then there's the light itself, the way it affects everything it touches. Survivors who've stood too close to these glowing seams have described feeling lightheaded, disoriented, like they're being pulled in 2 directions at once. One man said his vision blurred, and for a moment, he saw himself standing on a street that no longer exists, surrounded by faces he didn't recognize. He said it felt like a memory, but not one that belonged to him. He left the area immediately, and I can't say I blame him. Survivors, the sky isn't just a backdrop anymore. It's part of the war, part of whatever's happening to this world. Whether it's a side effect of the weapons we unleashed or a sign of something else waking up in the chaos, I can't say. What I do know is that these fractures, these lights, aren't random. They're too precise, too connected to everything else we're seeing. And like the symbols etched into the land, they're leaving a mark we can't ignore. So if you're out there tonight, under that fractured sky, keep your eyes open. Watch the light, but don't follow it. Listen to the silence, but don't linger in it. The sky is changing, survivors, and it's taking the rules we thought we knew along with it. The machines are getting smarter. That's not paranoia talking, it's observation. Survivors, if you've been keeping an eye on the skies, you've probably noticed it too. The drones aren't just mechanical pests anymore. They've evolved into something far more deliberate, far more dangerous. In the past few days, I've seen them operating in ways that make it impossible to dismiss their actions as programmed routines. They're hunting now, and they're learning from us. The first time I noticed this shift was 3 days ago. I was making my way through the outskirts of an old industrial zone, a place where the rust and silence almost drown each other out. The air was still, the kind of stillness that makes you second-guess every step. That's when I heard it, the faint, rhythmic hum that signals you're not alone. I ducked into a derelict factory and watched as a single drone hovered into view, its red spotlight scanning the ground with surgical precision. It moved slowly, methodically, like it wasn't just looking for signs of life. It was studying the terrain itself. It stayed there for hours, moving in a grid pattern over the area. I couldn't help but wonder what it was searching for. Supplies? Survivors? Or maybe something deeper, something we haven't even considered yet. When it finally left, its movements were precise, calculated, as if it had found exactly what it came for. This wasn't the clumsy surveillance we used to see in the early days. This was something else entirely. The drones are appearing in places they shouldn't, places where you'd think their sensors would struggle. Dense forests, narrow canyons, even deep into abandoned urban ruins. Survivors have reported seeing them adapt to obstacles, navigating environments that would have confused or trapped them before. One group described a drone weaving through the twisted wreckage of a collapsed overpass, its movements almost serpentine as it scanned the rubble. When they tried to use debris as cover, the drone shifted its position, hovering just out of sight before circling back. It was toying with them as if testing their reactions. And it's not just their movement that's changed. Their weapons are evolving too. Survivors have described drones equipped with lights that burn hot enough to scorch the ground, leaving blackened trails wherever they pass. Others report drones deploying projectiles that explode on impact, scattering sharp, chemical-laced shrapnel designed to incapacitate rather than kill. One man told me about a drone that fired something like a pulse, a low-frequency burst that left his ears ringing and his legs too weak to carry him. He barely managed to crawl away before another drone arrived to finish what the first one started. What's unsettling is the way they work together now. These drones aren't solitary anymore. They operate in coordinated groups, forming tight formations that cover every angle. Survivors who've tried to outmaneuver them have found themselves flanked, boxed in, with no clear way out. One group described being chased through an abandoned neighborhood by 3 drones that seemed to communicate silently, shifting their positions in perfect sync to cut off every escape route. It's as if they're thinking, planning, working toward a goal we can't see. Even more chilling are the reports of drones lying dormant. Survivors have stumbled across drones hidden in the most unexpected places, inside abandoned vehicles, beneath collapsed buildings, even submerged in shallow water. These drones don't activate immediately. They wait, as if listening for the right moment, the right trigger. One group found a shipping container in the middle of a clearing. When they opened it, they saw a single drone, motionless, its lights dim but blinking faintly. The moment they stepped inside, the drone came to life. They barely escaped before the container locked itself, trapping the drone and whoever was unlucky enough to be inside. The question that keeps gnawing at me is this: who's controlling them? Are these drones still following orders from some long-dead chain of command, running on autopilot in the ruins of a world that no longer exists? Or has something else taken over, something we don't understand yet. Survivors have speculated about rogue AI, about machines that have outgrown their original programming and started writing their own rules. Others think it's still human operators behind the curtain, pulling the strings from some hidden bunker. Neither answer is comforting. And then there are the signals. Survivors have reported strange bursts of static on unused radio frequencies, bursts that seem to coincide with drone activity. Some have tried to decipher the patterns, claiming they can hear faint voices buried in the noise, instructions or warnings too distorted to make out clearly. Whether these signals are guiding the drones or simply a byproduct of their operations, I don't know. But what I do know is this: they're not random. If you see a drone, don't assume you've been spotted just because its light hasn't touched you yet. These machines are patient. They'll hover, they'll wait, and when you think you're safe, that's when they'll strike. The drones have become more than just machines. They're predators, and they're watching us as closely as we're watching them. The skies aren't ours anymore. Survivors. They belong to the drones and whatever force controls them. Whether it's human or something else, the message is clear. The world we once knew is gone, and the rules are changing faster than we can keep up. Keep your eyes open, your movements deliberate, and your instincts sharp. These drones don't make mistakes, and neither can we. Survivors. Let me tell you about a place I came across recently. It wasn't like anything I've seen before. Picture this: an open-air market, the kind you'd find in small towns back when we still traded smiles and stories over fresh produce. Except this one wasn't bustling with life. It was silent, untouched, and completely wrong. The first thing that hit me was how pristine everything was. The stalls were still standing, their wooden frames unbroken and their canopies fluttering faintly in a wind I couldn't feel. Tables were lined with goods that should have rotted months ago. Apples polished to a shine, stacks of vegetables arranged in neat rows, even loaves of bread that looked fresh enough to tear apart. At first glance, it was surreal, too perfect, like stepping into a memory that didn't belong to me. But then the silence set in. Not the kind of quiet you expect from an abandoned place. The kind filled with faint echoes of birds or the rustle of leaves. This was absolute. No wind, no animals, no creak of wood shifting under time's weight. Just the absence of sound, thick and oppressive, pressing against me like a physical force. It was the kind of silence that makes your pulse sound louder in your ears, that makes you feel like you shouldn't be there. I moved through the rows cautiously, scanning every shadow, every corner. Nothing stirred, but the air felt wrong, dense, heavy, like it was holding its breath. Then I saw it, scrawled in jagged black letters across the side of a stall. Wait, just one word, etched deep enough into the wood to splinter it. At first, I thought it might be a warning, something left by survivors passing through. But the more I looked at it, the more deliberate it seemed. Like it wasn't meant for me or anyone else. Like it was a command waiting to be obeyed. I didn't linger. The farther I walked into that market, the stronger the sense of unease became. It wasn't just the silence. It was the stillness of everything around me. The produce didn't have a single blemish, not a speck of dust. The wooden stalls weren't weathered or cracked. Even the ground beneath my boots felt too clean, like it had been swept recently. It didn't belong. None of it did. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a faint shimmer, like heat rising off pavement. It was subtle, barely there, but it seemed to trace the edges of the market. A boundary, maybe, or a warning. I don't know what it was, but I wasn't about to find out. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the stalls until I was far enough to feel the air shift back to normal, the kind of normal we've come to expect in this broken world. This wasn't the first time I've heard of places like this. Survivors have told me about similar anomalies. Buildings that seem untouched by time, streets where the air feels heavier, spaces that feel too perfect to be real. Most of them describe the same feeling I had, that they didn't belong there, that they were intruding on something they couldn't understand. One survivor I spoke to described a small diner she stumbled upon while scavenging. The neon sign above the door was still glowing, even though the power grid has been dead for months. Inside, the tables were set with plates of food that looked fresh, steam still rising from the dishes. But the air was thick with that same silence, that oppressive stillness that presses against your skin. She didn't stay long, and neither did I. The question is, what are these places? Are they traps set by forces we don't understand? Are they remnants of a world we've lost, preserved in pockets where the rules of nature have broken down? Or are they something else entirely, something waiting for us to make the wrong move? I don't have answers, survivors, only questions that multiply the longer I think about them. What I do know is this: these places aren't natural. They don't follow the patterns we've come to recognize in this new world. They feel deliberate, like they were placed here for a reason. Maybe they're remnants of experiments, pockets of reality that slipped through the cracks during the chaos. Or maybe they're signals, messages meant for someone or something that isn't us. If you come across a place like the silent market, trust your instincts. If it feels too perfect, too quiet, too still, it probably is. These places aren't what they seem, and the things inside them, no matter how tempting, don't belong to us. I walked away from that market with nothing but questions, and maybe that's all I was meant to take. Questions, and a lingering sense that I wasn't the only one watching. The world is changing, survivors, and it's leaving pieces of itself behind in ways we can't yet understand. If you find those pieces, don't try to put them together. Some puzzles aren't meant to be solved, and some doors aren't meant to be opened. Keep your distance and keep moving. Survivors, if the ground beneath your feet feels stable, count yourself lucky. Lately, even the earth seems restless, twisting and breaking in ways that defy explanation. I've seen fissures opening where there were none before, roads disappearing into voids, and cliffs forming overnight. But the strangest thing I've encountered so far is the canyon I stumbled across 3 days ago. It wasn't supposed to be there. The map I've relied on for weeks didn't show anything, just a flat expanse where an old industrial complex used to stand. But when I arrived, the ground opened up like a wound in the earth, a jagged gash stretching as far as I could see. The edges of the canyon weren't natural. They weren't the weathered, crumbling lines you'd expect from erosion. They were sharp, clean, as if the land had been sliced apart by something precise and unyielding. Standing there, looking down into that chasm, I couldn't shake the feeling that the canyon wasn't just a place. It was a presence. The walls glowed faintly in the dim light, not bright enough to illuminate, but enough to hint at shapes and shadows deep below. The glow was green, pulsing rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. It wasn't steady, though. It flickered at times, as if struggling to hold itself together. I called out, testing the echo, expecting to hear my voice bounce back in distorted fragments. But what came back wasn't my voice, at least not entirely. The first echo sounded normal enough, faint and distant, trailing off as it should. But then there was another, and another, overlapping like whispers, each one quieter than the last. And then came something I wasn't ready for. Words I hadn't spoken, phrases from old broadcasts, distorted and stretched, mixed with fragments of sentences I couldn't place. It was as if the canyon wasn't just reflecting sound, it was remembering it, reshaping it, playing it back in ways that didn't make sense. I stayed on the edge, listening, trying to piece together the fragments. Most of it was unintelligible, just noise and static shaped into something almost human. But there were moments, brief, chilling moments, when the words were clear. Phrases like, "keep moving," and "it's already here." One of them, I swear, was my own voice saying, "Don't look down." I hadn't said that, not out loud, not even in my head. But there it was, echoing back at me from the void. The air around the canyon was heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. It pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe, like the atmosphere itself was pushing me away. And the longer I stood there, the stronger the feeling grew that I was being watched. Not just from above, but from below. I didn't see anything moving in the depths, but the shadows down there felt alive, shifting and rippling like they were aware of my presence. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave. That's when I noticed something carved into the rock near the edge. It wasn't just cracks or natural formations. These were symbols etched deep and precise. spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that didn't belong to any language I recognized. They seemed to glow faintly, the same green hue as the canyon's depths, pulsing in time with the light below. I didn't touch them. I didn't want to know what would happen if I did. As I turned to leave, the echoes shifted again. This time, they weren't just random fragments. They formed a pattern, a rhythm, almost like a chant. It wasn't in any language I understood, but the cadence was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat turned into sound. It followed me as I backed away, growing fainter but never completely fading. Even when I was miles away, I thought I could still hear it, faint and distant, like the canyon's voice was chasing me. I've heard from other survivors about places like this, areas where the land itself seems alive, where the ground whispers and the air hums with an unnatural energy. One group described a sinkhole that appeared overnight, its edges lined with the same spirals and symbols I saw. They said the air around it felt wrong, like it was vibrating, and the deeper they looked, the harder it was to pull themselves away. Another survivor told me about a crack in the ground that seemed to follow him, stretching and widening wherever he walked, until he finally left the area. Whatever's causing these anomalies, it's not random. The patterns, the symbols, the echoes, they're connected, part of something larger that we don't understand yet. The ground isn't just breaking apart, it's reshaping itself, leaving marks that feel deliberate, purposeful. And the more we see, the clearer it becomes. These places aren't meant for us. They're warnings or traps or maybe something worse. If you find yourself near one of these canyons, these fissures, these scars in the earth, don't linger. The land remembers, survivors. It holds onto the echoes of everything that's happened, everything we've lost, and it plays them back in ways that can break you if you're not careful. Trust your instincts, trust your fear, and don't ignore the signs. The ground beneath us is changing, and it's taking the rules with it. Survivors, I've walked through forests before. I've heard the crunch of leaves underfoot, felt the cool press of shade on a hot day, and once, long ago, even found peace in their quiet. But the forest I encountered yesterday was something else entirely. It wasn't peaceful, and it certainly wasn't quiet. It felt alive in a way that forests shouldn't, not with life, but with intent. It started at the tree line. The air changed the moment I stepped beneath the canopy, growing colder, heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. The light dimmed, not because of clouds or the density of the leaves, but because the forest itself seemed to be swallowing it. What little sunlight made it through the branches was fragmented, scattering in strange patterns on the ground, spiraling and twisting in ways that made my head spin if I stared too long. The trees were wrong. They weren't just growing, they were contorting. Their trunks twisted unnaturally, their bark cracked and spiraling like something had grabbed hold of them and wrenched them into shapes they were never meant to take. Some of the branches stretched too far, bending low to the ground as if reaching for something or someone. Others formed arches overhead, creating tunnels that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into the shadows. And then there were the sounds. At first, it was subtle, faint creaks and groans, the kind you might expect from old trees swaying in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still, heavy, almost suffocating. The creaks grew louder, sharper, until they sounded less like trees and more like voices, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was there, a rhythm that matched the pulse in the ground beneath my feet. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. The forest didn't just feel alive, it felt aware. Paths that should have been straight began to curve, leading me in circles no matter how carefully I tracked my steps. Trees I'd marked with scratches or small notches in the bark seemed to shift, the marks disappearing or moving higher, as if the trees were pulling them out of reach. The ground itself wasn't stable. It felt soft, almost spongy in places, and when I pressed my boot into it, I swear I felt it push back, like the forest was rejecting me. About an hour in, I came across a clearing. At least that's what it looked like at first. The trees formed a perfect circle around a patch of bare, dark earth. In the center stood a single tree, taller and straighter than the others, its bark smooth and almost metallic in the dim light. Carved into its trunk were symbols, spirals, jagged lines, and patterns I couldn't place, glowing faintly with a greenish hue. The air around the tree was thick, almost electric, and the whispers grew louder as I approached, merging into a low, continuous hum. I didn't touch the tree. Every instinct screamed at me to stay back, to leave the clearing and the forest entirely. But something about the tree felt magnetic, like it was pulling at me, not physically, but mentally, emotionally. I could feel it pressing against my thoughts, planting the idea that I needed to know, that I needed to understand what it was and why it was there. I forced myself to step away, but the sensation didn't fade. It lingered, a presence in the back of my mind. Even as I turned and walked back toward the tree line, that's when the forest began to shift in earnest. The murmurs turned into something sharper, something closer to voices, though still unintelligible. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches lowering like claws, their trunks pressing together to block the way. The ground buckled beneath my feet, forcing me to stumble and change direction. I tried to retrace my steps, to find the marks I'd made, but they were gone. The forest wasn't just alive. It was reacting to me, shaping itself to keep me from leaving. Panic set in, but only for a moment. I reminded myself to keep moving, to keep my mind clear, to focus on the faint light filtering through the canopy. That light became my guide, my only anchor in a place that felt like it was trying to swallow me whole. Every step was a fight against the pull of the forest, against the sense that it wanted me to stay, to become part of it. When I finally broke through the tree line, the air shifted again. It felt lighter, thinner, like I could finally breathe. The whispers stopped, the murmurs fading into the distance as if the forest had decided to let me go. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the trees were watching, if they were shifting back into place, waiting for the next intruder. Survivors, I don't know what that forest was or why it felt the way it did. I only know that it wasn't natural. It wasn't safe. If you find yourself near a forest that feels off, where the air grows too heavy, the paths twist without reason, and the trees seem to move, don't go in. Whatever lives there, whatever controls it, isn't something we're meant to understand. The land is changing, survivors, and some places are no longer ours to walk. Survivors, I've been thinking a lot about reflections lately. Mirrors, windows, even the still surfaces of puddles. Things we've all looked at 1,000 times without a second thought. But now, in this fractured world, they've become something else entirely. They're not just reflecting us anymore. They're showing something else, something we're not supposed to see. Started 2 nights ago when I found shelter in an old gas station. The windows were mostly intact, though grime and cracks distorted the glass. It was quiet, too quiet, but I told myself it was safe enough for a few hours' rest. As the light faded, the shadows stretched, and the glass began to catch the glow of my lantern. That's when I noticed it. My reflection wasn't moving the way it should. At first, it was subtle. A hesitation when I turned my head, a flicker that didn't quite match the rhythm of my steps. I chalked it up to exhaustion, to the tricks your mind plays when you're running on fumes. But then it got worse. My reflection started moving on its own. It turned its head to look at something behind me, something I couldn't see. I spun around, expecting to find someone, or something. There, nothing, just empty shelves and the faint hum of the lantern. I tried to ignore it, to focus on preparing for the night, but the reflection wouldn't let me. Every time I glanced at the glass, it was doing something different, waving, pointing, smiling. Not a kind smile either. It was sharp, stretched, a mockery of the expression it was supposed to be. And its eyes, my eyes, weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking through me, as if I wasn't the person it was reflecting. I covered the windows, turned the lantern away, and tried to sleep, but the unease stayed with me. I could feel it, that presence just beyond the glass, watching, waiting. When I finally left at dawn, I didn't look back at the windows. I didn't want to know if it was still there, watching me leave. Since then, I've been hearing from survivors about similar experiences. One group described finding a pond in the middle of a dense forest. The water was perfectly still, its surface so smooth it looked like glass. When they leaned over to look, their reflections didn't match their movements. One of them swore they saw a second figure standing behind their reflection, something tall and dark with no features. They ran, and they said the reflection stayed behind, watching them go. Another survivor told me about a shattered mirror they found in an abandoned house. The pieces were scattered across the floor, reflecting fragments of the room. But when they looked closer, the reflections didn't match what was in front of them. The room in the mirror was untouched, pristine, as if the house had never fallen into ruin. And in the center of the reflection, they saw a figure standing where they were supposed to be, staring back at them, unmoving, unblinking. They left the house immediately, but they said they couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had followed them, just out of sight. What's even stranger is how these reflections seem to react to light. Survivors have reported that the more light you cast on them, the more active they become. One man described shining a flashlight into a broken storefront window, trying to see what was inside. The reflection in the glass didn't show the light, it showed darkness, as if the flashlight had been extinguished the moment it hit the glass. He said the darkness spread across the window, swallowing the reflection entirely, until all he could see was a void. Then there are the whispers. Survivors have reported hearing faint voices coming from reflective surfaces, voices that seem to echo their own thoughts, their own words. One woman described looking into a small hand mirror she'd carried for months, only to hear her own voice repeating the words she'd just spoken aloud. But the tone was off, colder, sharper, as if it wasn't really her voice at all. She smashed the mirror and left it behind, but she said she could still hear the whispers for hours afterward. I don't know what these reflections are, or why they're behaving this way. Maybe they're cracks in reality, glimpses into a parallel world that's bleeding into ours. Maybe there's something else entirely, something older and more dangerous. What I do know is that they're not harmless. They're watching us, and they're waiting for something. If you come across a reflective surface that feels wrong, where the light bends strangely, or your reflection doesn't quite match, don't linger. Cover it, avoid it, or leave it behind entirely. These reflections aren't just mirrors anymore. They're windows to something we can't understand, and they're looking back at us with eyes that don't belong to this world. Stay cautious, survivors. The things we once trusted to show us the truth are turning into lies, and the line between reality and illusion is thinner than we ever imagined. Survivors, it's one thing to lose your way because of poor planning, bad weather, or simple exhaustion. But what I've seen in the past 2 days is something entirely different. The roads are disappearing, not blocked by debris or hidden under overgrowth, but truly vanishing. And the ones that remain, they're changing, twisting, becoming something unrecognizable. It started when I was heading toward what used to be a well-mapped town. I'd taken the same road once before, months ago, when the world still made sense. Back then, it was straightforward. A 2-lane stretch of cracked asphalt, flanked by fields and the occasional dilapidated farmhouse. This time, the road didn't lead where it was supposed to. After a few miles, it began to curve where it never had before, bending sharply into a dense thicket of trees that shouldn't have been there. I tried to retrace my steps, to find the path I'd taken before, but the road behind me wasn't the same either. The familiar landmarks, an old gas station, a broken-down truck, were gone, replaced by overgrown ditches and unfamiliar terrain. It was as if the road had rewritten itself the moment I stepped onto it, shifting to lead me somewhere I didn't want to go. The strangest part was how deliberate it felt. The asphalt wasn't cracked or weathered, but smooth and pristine, as if it had been freshly paved. The yellow lines that once guided my way were gone, replaced by faint markings that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. They weren't straight either, they spiraled and curved, forming patterns that hurt to look at for too long. I kept moving, thinking I could outpace whatever was happening, but the road had other plans. It began to fragment, splitting into multiple paths that crisscrossed and looped back on themselves. I tried to follow the most stable-looking route, but no matter how far I walked, the scenery didn't change. It felt like I was moving in circles, trapped in some kind of loop designed to confuse and disorient me. Then came the sounds. At first, It was just the faint hum of the wind, rising and falling like a distant melody. But as I pressed on, the hum grew louder, more rhythmic, until it sounded almost like breathing. It wasn't coming from the trees or the fields. It was coming from the road itself, pulsing in time with my footsteps. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I moved, it followed. Eventually, I came across what looked like an intersection, for roads converged in a perfect square, their edges lined with reflective markers that blinked faintly in the gathering dusk. In the center of the intersection was a sign, but not the kind you'd expect. It wasn't a stop sign or a directional marker. It was a flat, black panel with a single word etched into its surface: choose. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at that sign, trying to make sense of it. The air around the intersection was heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. The hum had stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. I knew I had to pick a path, but every direction felt wrong, like each one led to a different kind of danger. I finally chose the road to my left, not because it looked any safer, but because it felt the least unnatural. As I stepped onto it, the other paths seemed to dissolve, fading into the shadows until they were nothing but memory. The road I'd chosen stretched ahead, twisting and turning in impossible ways, leading me deeper into unfamiliar territory. The markings on the asphalt shimmered again, forming shapes I couldn't recognize, but I didn't stop to study them. I just kept moving, one foot in front of the other, until the air began to lighten and the hum faded completely. When I finally emerged from that nightmare, I found myself miles away from where I'd started, in a part of the region I didn't recognize. The road behind me was gone, replaced by an expanse of wild grass and broken stone. It was as if it had never existed, as if the world had erased it the moment I stepped off. I've heard from other survivors about roads like this, places where the paths you thought you knew lead you somewhere else entirely. One group described a highway that seemed to stretch endlessly, its horizon always just out of reach. Another survivor told me about a bridge that vanished the moment she set foot on it, leaving her stranded on a narrow ledge above a rushing river. These disappearing roads aren't random. They're deliberate, like the world is reshaping itself beneath our feet, guiding us or trapping us, according to rules we don't understand. The paths we take aren't just physical anymore. They're choices, and those choices have consequences we can't always see. If you find yourself on a road that feels wrong, where the markings shift, the air hums, or the path twists in ways that defy logic, turn back if you can, and if you can't, tread carefully. The ground beneath us is changing, survivors, and it's taking us with it, whether we want to go or not. Survivors, we've all seen wildlife behaving strangely. Animals we used to understand have been acting in ways that defy explanation. But what I saw yesterday left me shaken in a way I didn't expect. It wasn't just strange. It felt like a message, though I couldn't tell if it was meant as a warning or something worse. It started in an open field, just past a line of collapsed power poles. The area was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that puts you on edge. I thought I was alone until I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a group of birds, crows maybe, circling in the sky. But when I looked closer, I realized they weren't flying. They were perched in the grass, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, spread out across the field like black stones. They weren't moving. No fluttering wings, no shifting feet. Just sitting there, perfectly still, their heads all turned in the same direction, toward me. I froze, unsure of what to do. Birds scatter when you get close, right? They take off in a burst of noise and feathers. But these didn't. They just stayed there, watching. Their eyes weren't the sharp, curious kind you'd expect from a bird. They were dull, glassy, like polished stones reflecting the faint light of the overcast sky. I took a cautious step forward, then another, expecting them to move. They didn't. The only sound was the crunch of dry grass under my boots. It wasn't until I was halfway across the field that I noticed the pattern. They weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged in lines, rows, and columns like some kind of living grid, and every single one of them was angled perfectly toward me, their heads tilted just slightly, as if they were waiting for me to make the next move. I kept walking, keeping my pace steady, my eyes on the path ahead. But the farther I went, the more the air felt wrong. It was heavy, pressing against my skin like an invisible hand. And then the whispers started. Faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze that wasn't there. I couldn't make out the words, if they even were words, but they had a rhythm, a cadence that felt deliberate, almost purposeful. That's when I noticed the deer. It was standing at the far edge of the field, just beyond the last row of birds. Like them, it was perfectly still, its head turned toward me. Its eyes weren't like the birds, though. They were bright, almost too bright, like they were reflecting a light I couldn't see. It didn't move as I approached, didn't flinch or even blink. It just stared, unblinking, its body frozen in a way that didn't feel natural. I stopped about 20 feet away, unsure of what to do. The whispers were louder now, not coming from the birds or the deer, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. The rows of birds seemed to tighten around me, their stillness becoming oppressive, suffocating. And then, as if on cue, the deer took a single step forward. That one step was enough to break whatever composure I had left. I turned and walked quickly back the way I came, resisting the urge to run. The whispers followed me, growing fainter with each step, until they finally faded into silence. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the birds or the deer were following, or if they'd vanished the moment I left. Later, when I was far enough away to feel somewhat safe, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I'd heard stories from survivors about animals acting strangely, wolves circling without attacking, foxes watching from the shadows, even reports of glowing fish in rivers that ran dry. But this was different. This wasn't just strange behavior. It was deliberate, organized, like the field and everything in it was part of some larger design. One survivor I spoke to described a similar encounter. He'd come across a pack of wolves standing in a clearing, their bodies rigid, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. They didn't attack, didn't growl or move. They just watched as he passed, their heads turning in unison to follow his every step. He said the experience left him feeling marked, like the wolves had claimed something from him just by looking. Another survivor told me about a group of birds she'd seen perched on the branches of a dead tree. Like the ones I encountered, they didn't move, didn't make a sound. But when she walked away, she swore she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, matching her pace exactly. She never saw who or what was following, but she felt the presence long after she left the area. Whatever is happening to these animals, it's not natural. It's not random. They're being drawn to something, changed by it, shaped into patterns and behaviors we don't understand. And it's not just the animals. It's the land, the air, the rules we thought we knew. Everything is shifting, aligning itself into something deliberate, something intentional. If you find yourself in a place where the wildlife feels wrong, where they don't scatter, where they don't behave as they should, trust your instincts. Leave. Whatever is controlling them, whatever force is shaping their behavior, it's not something we can fight or reason with. The world is changing, survivors, and the things we once thought were beneath our notice are now staring us down, waiting for us to make the next move. Survivors, I've talked before about how the world seems to be changing, rewriting itself in ways we can barely understand. But there's something I need to address now, something that's been growing in scale and intensity. The silent zones. These are places where the air itself feels wrong, where sound dies, and the world seems to hold its breath. I encountered one yesterday, and I'm still trying to piece together what happened. It started as a faint pressure in my ears, the kind you get when you're climbing too high or diving too deep. The road I was walking seemed normal enough. Broken asphalt lined with overgrowth, faint traces of an old gas station in the distance. But the closer I got to that station, the quieter everything became. First, the crunch of my boots on the gravel softened. Then the wind in the trees faded, replaced by an oppressive stillness that pressed against my skin like a heavy blanket. When I reached the edge of the silent zone, the change was immediate and absolute. There was no sound, not even the faint buzz of insects or the distant rustle of leaves. It wasn't just quiet, it was an absence, a vacuum that swallowed every noise. leaving only the rhythm of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Even that felt wrong, too loud, as if it didn't belong in the space I was standing in. The gas station ahead was completely still, its windows intact but coated in a thick layer of grime that blocked any view inside. A faint, grayish light seemed to hang over the building, not from the sun but from the air itself, as if the atmosphere had dimmed without a source. I hesitated at the edge of the zone, every instinct telling me to turn back, but curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pulled me forward. The silence grew heavier with each step, like I was sinking into a deep pool. By the time I reached the station, it felt like the air was pressing against me, trying to force me out. I pushed the door open, half expecting it to scream on rusted hinges. But there was no sound, just the faint vibration of the door moving under my hand. Inside, the shelves were mostly empty, save for a few cans of expired food and a layer of dust that seemed untouched by time. But it wasn't the emptiness that unnerved me. It was the mirrors, every surface that could reflect. Windows, countertops, even the dull chrome of the refrigerator doors seemed sharper, clearer, as if they were holding on to something the air couldn't carry. And in each reflection, I saw myself, not distorted or delayed, but too clear, too real. It felt like I was being watched, not by the mirrors, but by the thing looking back at me through them. I moved carefully, trying not to disturb anything. The silence seemed to amplify every movement, every breath, turning them into an intrusion. Then I noticed something etched into the far wall, faint and jagged like it had been scratched in a hurry. It was a single word: listen. I didn't want to. Every part of me wanted to get out of that place, to step back into the world where sound still existed. But something about that word kept me frozen, staring at it like it held an answer I couldn't understand. That's when I heard it. Not a sound, but a vibration. A low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the air itself. It wasn't in my ears. It was inside me, pressing against my ribs, sinking with my heartbeat until I couldn't tell where it ended and I began. I stumbled out of the station, my chest tight, my vision swimming. The pulse followed me, fading only when I crossed back into the world of sound. The moment I left the silent zone, the noise hit me like a wave, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a crow, the sound of my own ragged breathing. It was overwhelming, almost too much to bear after the oppressive quiet. But it was a relief, a reminder that I was still part of the world I understood, even if it was falling apart. Since then, I've heard from other survivors about these zones. One group described a factory where every machine had fallen silent, its halls echoing with nothing but the sound of their footsteps. Another man told me about a house he'd entered where no sound could penetrate, not even his own voice. He said he felt watched the entire time, as if the house itself was aware of him, judging him, waiting for something he couldn't give. These silent zones aren't just voids. They're something more, something alive. They seem to hold the echoes of what used to be, and maybe what's yet to come. I don't know what causes them or why they exist, but they're spreading, appearing in places that once seemed untouched by whatever force is reshaping the world. If you come across one, tread carefully. The silence isn't just a lack of sound. It's a presence, a reminder that the rules we thought we knew no longer apply. And whatever's in that silence, whatever's listening, it's waiting for something from us. Survivors, I need to tell you about the ground beneath our feet. For most of us, the earth has been a constant, something we've relied on even as the world above it crumbles. But now, even that is changing. I've seen things in the last few days that make me question whether the land itself is turning against us, or being transformed into something we can't comprehend. It began with a fissure I found along an old road. Cracks in the asphalt are nothing new, but this one was different. It wasn't the jagged, irregular break you'd expect from shifting ground. It was clean, precise, running in a perfect line across the pavement. The edges glowed faintly, a sickly green that pulsed like a heartbeat. I stood at the edge, staring down into the fissure, and what I saw shouldn't have been possible. The glow came from deep within, far below where any light should reach. It wasn't steady either. It flickered and shifted, casting faint shadows on the walls of the fissure. The air around it felt charged, like the static before a lightning strike, and there was a faint hum, just on the edge of hearing, that seemed to come from the earth itself. I dropped a small rock into the fissure, watching as it disappeared into the glow. There was no sound when it landed, no echo to suggest a bottom. It just fell, swallowed by the light, leaving nothing behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that the fissure was alive, that it wasn't just an opening in the earth, but a gateway to something deeper, something we weren't meant to see. I've heard similar stories from other survivors. One group described a field where the ground seemed to ripple beneath their feet, as though the earth were breathing. They said the grass glowed faintly in the moonlight, casting shadows that moved even when the wind was still. Another survivor told me about a sinkhole that appeared overnight, its edges smooth and unnatural, with a soft blue glow emanating from its depths. He said he could hear faint whispers coming from the hole, like voices carried on a distant wind. Then there are the places where the ground seems to reject us entirely. I came across one such area a day after finding the fissure. It was a stretch of open land, barren and dry, with cracks spidering out in every direction. The air was thick with heat, though the sun was hidden behind clouds. As I walked, the ground seemed to shift beneath me, as if it were alive, pushing back against each step. I knelt to touch the soil, and it felt warm, almost hot, like something was burning just beneath the surface. I moved quickly after that, but the feeling stayed with me, the sense that the earth itself was trying to warn me or maybe drive me away. The further I went, the more I noticed the changes. The trees around the area were warped, their trunks twisting like corkscrews, their leaves brittle and pale. The ground beneath them was littered with strange marks, spirals and patterns that looked like they'd been burned into the soil. Survivors have told me about similar marks, symbols carved or scorched into the earth in places where the land feels different. Some say they've seen these symbols glowing faintly at night, pulsating in time with the strange hum that seems to accompany them. One man described finding a clearing where the marks formed a perfect circle, the air above it shimmering like heat waves. He didn't stay long, but he said he felt watched the entire time, as if the land itself was aware of his presence. And it's not just the marks or the glow. There's something beneath the surface, survivors, something moving. I've heard reports of faint vibrations in the ground, rhythmic and steady, like the beating of a distant drum. Survivors have described feeling the vibrations under their feet, growing stronger as they approached certain areas. One woman told me about a hill where the ground seemed to pulse, each vibration stronger than the last, until she felt like the earth would crack open beneath her. She left before it could, but the sensation haunted her long after. I don't know what's causing these changes, but they're not random. The glow, the marks, the vibrations, they're all connected, part of something bigger, something deeper than we can see. The land is shifting, survivors, not just physically, but in ways we don't yet understand. And whatever is driving these changes, it's not slowing down. It's growing, spreading, taking over the world we once knew. If you come across a place that feels wrong, where the ground hums, the air vibrates, or the earth glows, don't linger. These are not places for us anymore. The land is changing, and it's not changing for us. Stay sharp, stay cautious, and trust your instincts. The world beneath our feet is no longer the one we used to know. Survivors, as I sit here speaking to you, I'm struck by the weight of it all. The air feels heavier tonight, doesn't it? Maybe it's the silence, the way the world seems to pull tighter with every passing moment. Or maybe it's the knowledge that even as we fight to stay alive, the rules are being rewritten beneath our feet. Whatever it is, I know this, despite everything, you're still here. We're still here. It's easy to let the darkness consume you, to give in to the relentless pressure of survival. We've all felt it, that creeping despair that whispers in the quiet moments. But every breath you take, every step you manage, is proof that you've defied the odds. Don't lose sight of that. Survival isn't just about enduring. It's about holding on to the pieces of yourself that matter, the fragments that make you human. The world out there is a hostile one. You've heard it in my stories, and I'm sure you've seen it with your own eyes. Roads that lead nowhere, animals that watch with a predatory stillness, and places where even the ground seems alive with intent. But it's not all chaos. In the strangest ways, there's order too, a pattern to the madness that hints at something larger. I can't tell you what that something is, not yet, but I believe there's meaning buried in the noise, a purpose we haven't yet uncovered. I've been thinking a lot about purpose lately. What drives us to keep going when the world feels like it's falling apart? For me, it's this broadcast, these words, this connection with you, the knowledge that even if I'm speaking into the void, someone out there might be listening. It's not much, but it's enough to keep me moving, enough to keep me fighting. I want you to think about what keeps you going. Maybe it's a memory, a face, a voice, a moment you can't let go of. Maybe it's the person next to you, the one who's shared your struggles, your victories, your grief. Or maybe it's the hope that somewhere out there, a better world is waiting, one we can reach if we just hold on long enough. Whatever it is, cling to it. Let it anchor you when everything else feels like it's slipping away. I've met survivors who've lost everything: family, friends, the places they once called home. And yet they keep moving. They find reasons to smile, to laugh, to care, even when it feels impossible. One man I spoke to told me about a patch of sunflowers he'd planted in the rubble of his old neighborhood. He said it wasn't about growing food or finding shelter. It was about creating something beautiful in a world that had forgotten how. That's the kind of resilience we need. Survivors. The kind that refuses to let the world take everything from us. It's not just about the big gestures, either. Sometimes, it's the small things that matter most. Sharing a meal with someone who's hungrier than you are. Leaving a note for the next person to pass through. Warning them of dangers or guiding them to safety. These acts of kindness, as small as they might seem, are what keep us connected. They remind us that we're not alone, that even in the darkest times, humanity still matters. But holding on to hope doesn't mean ignoring the dangers. We can't afford to be reckless, to let our guard down, even for a moment. The world is a minefield now, and every step must be deliberate. Pay attention to the signs, the whispers in the wind, the shifting patterns in the ground. Trust your instincts and don't be afraid to walk away from something that feels wrong. Survival is a balance, a dance between caution and courage. Find that balance and hold it tight. As I speak to you now, I know some of you are listening in places I can't even imagine. Maybe you're huddled in a shelter, the walls barely holding against the weight of the world outside. Maybe you're walking down a broken highway, the horizon stretching out endlessly before you. Or maybe you're sitting in the ruins of a place that once felt like home, trying to make sense of what's left. Wherever you are, know this: you're not alone. Even if it feels like it, even if the silence presses in and the shadows stretch too far, you're part of something bigger, a network of survivors, each of us fighting in our own way to carve out a space in this fractured world. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. None of us do. But I do know this: as long as we keep moving, as long as we keep fighting, there's a chance. A chance to find each other, to rebuild, to create something worth living for. It won't be easy. It won't be fast. But it's possible. And as long as it's possible, it's worth fighting for. So, survivors, as you move through this night, remember what keeps you going. Remember who you are and who you want to be. Hold on to the light, even when it feels like it's slipping away. And above all, stay human. It's the one thing the world can't take from us, no matter how hard it tries. This is Atlas, signing off for now. I'll be here as long as I can, sending these words out into the void, hoping they find you. Stay sharp, stay safe, and don't forget, you're stronger than you think.